Hi, and welcome to the March sessions for the Open Security Summit. We are joined by Marius for a great session today, so I shall hand you over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just do a presentation. So welcome all. My name is Marius. I'm a cloud security architect for Domino's, but predominantly been working in security operations space and basically been hired by Domino's to build a security operations center from scratch, which I've been doing over the last year. So this is kind of the sharing of my kind of journey and what I've done and kind of given an idea to you how we can leverage Mitre Attack and build a better SOC. I think everyone's kind of evolving and going into that space towards usage of Mitre Attack. So that's where we are. So I think we can begin with a brief kind of explanation and introduction to what Mitre Attack is and why we would use it, and then ideally I will guys show you a bit of intro how to build a heat map, how we can do layers with Mitre Navigator, different use cases, how we can use Mitre Attack from SOC maturity to emulation of threat actors, how we can better our defenses and mature our SOC function. So firstly, what Mitre Attack is. So Mitre Ingenuity and Center for Threat Informed Defense have come together with some big organizations as a research product to kind of develop a framework that uses common language and it can be shared around the world, where how we can it's kind of a knowledge base adversary tactics and techniques based on real world scenarios, basically. And attack itself is a kind of an iteration and a matrix built on cyber kill chain. So it's basically a next iteration of 14 tactics that goes from the kind of beginning of attack all the way to the end of the attack and what's their goals of threat actors. So, and it has now, I think we are on version 10 and it has over 300 techniques by now. So it's been iterating and evolving over the last few years, and it just gets better and better. And I think adoption grows along various tools and processes and how we can better align with it. I think what it helps us as well, it allows us to track behaviors that threat actors use, and how we can emulate and test our defenses against them and our capabilities and our tools. I think it's kind of a great path kind of leading towards working towards purple teaming. And kind of the main use cases for it, it's used kind of for, as I mentioned, for adversary emulation, red teaming. Also, I think, and what's cool with it is, and I'll show you in Navigator, how we can do defensive gap assessments, your SOC maturity assessments, and whole of kind of how we can enrich our cyber threat intelligence. So that's how it's basically been developed. I think the key answer to ask, to question and to ask is, why are we using Mitre Attack? And I think the kind of after we cover the use cases, I think we'll ask some of these questions. But I stole kind of the slide from Veroni, so I think this kind of, it shows a various kind of use cases, and what I mentioned, how we can determine, because what we did as well with Mitre Attack in Domino's, we kind of embedded into our strategy. So it's kind of a two-way strategy fold. So it kind of looks top down from risk and up down from threats and kind of threat sophistication levels and how much we're going to cover it, and up to what level, threat sophistication level, we're going to work to kind of build up our defenses in our security operations center. So it helps with plan your strategy. A great tool for build your defenses. You can monitor attack trends, use it reference as a guide. You can determine threats, even find solution methods. And the other one, the big one, is to assess and close gaps in your defenses. And especially, I think the key aspect of it is with Mitre Attack, the way you align with it, you build your defenses on the threats that are relevant to you. So you do your research based on threats, where and how they work, and where what kind of areas they operate in, what organizations they attack, and you basically the threats that are relevant to you. That's how you can build your defenses. So the key question is why we do that. I think as we move on, I think some of you guys might have seen this pyramid of pain, but as we kind of threats are evolved and the way APT groups are keep evolving, things like, hash values, IP addresses, even domain names nowadays in malware is become very trivial, and they are very easy to be reused and resold with various, malware as a service, even ransomware as a service. So, if you align your defenses based on, for example, if you ingest your IOCs only by kind of hash values, they're very trivial, because in a malware, even changing one character it will change the hash value. So your defenses no longer will be able to detect that. IP addresses are, fairly easy to be changed, same as domain names. So I think we're moving towards that pyramid of pain towards the top, where the way APT groups have developed their tactics and techniques, it's hard for them to mold and change. So that's how we track the threat actors, and potentially we can better defend against them, but as well detect them in our environments, and how we can bolster our defenses with that. So that's the whole kind of emulation and change how we're leading towards the the upper side of the pyramid. So I'll show you the next one. Is so basically that's what that's the steps we've took, and how we kind of been evolving and building our security operations center. So first and foremost, I think, as I mentioned, the kind of key factors to determine and do your research, what threat actors are relevant to you. So based on your geopolitical situation, based on your geography, based on the business you deal with, whether you deal with manufacturing, finance, and do you hold financial data, credit card data. You can do your research and find the threat actors that would be relevant for your organization, and potentially the ones that would be attacking you. So I think, normally I say, when I get asked, normally I say, don't expand too far and wide. Start with sort of top 5-8 organizations, and you can build a heat map from that, and you can build a kind of a first line of kind of alignment of kind of heat map. What techniques are relevant for you to build your defenses against? And once you build a heat map, you can map every single technique to a data source, so what you can ingest into your SIEM, and then you basically map those techniques to log sources, build the use cases. You can also, there's few iterations now, I think, as Mitre kind of attack have developed a various kind of frameworks. So you got Mitre defend, even you can use for hardening your systems against relevant threats. I think another good tool to use when you kind of building use cases and developing analytics is use consult Mitre, which is cyber analytics repository. So you can develop analytics and basically how we can detect those techniques in our, based on the log sources that we are ingesting. And then we kind of go towards building automation. We build, specific responses to specific, analytics that potentially don't need, human interaction. So we can reduce the noise. We work on towards, filtering out false negatives and false positives. And I think that the last kind of iteration where we reach kind of the high maturity SOC is we map those techniques. Again, the same techniques you can map to the kind of the last iteration of the phases, mapping them to shield. So that's the kind of the next advanced stages where we kind of build and work towards deception technology. So hopefully to, increase the dwell time, that threat actors would spend in our environment, but at the same time that feeds our research cycle, see what kind of techniques, what kind of potential CVEs that threat actors trying to exploit in our network, and this again feeds our blue team, how we can build and harden our defenses, and how we can it feeds that iteration cycle, how we can just do it better and better. So that's kind of the kind of the framework that we followed. So before I show the heat map, I think the goal would be is if I can show you guys how we can actually do that by using Mitre Navigator. So 2 seconds. So if I share this screen with you guys. So this is how Mitre Attack Navigator looks like. So the idea is, and what we've been doing is build the layers, and from these layers you can build layer from layer. So obviously, hopefully guys you are familiar with it, but if you're not, so I'll just show you a simple task how we can build one layer and then how we can combine them. So if we use enterprise, and I'll just use an example, we can select a few groups that potentially are could be relevant to us. So normally a good place probably to start is if you're dealing with any credit card data and things like that. We've got financial crime organizations, so normally these are good to track. So for something like Fin7, so we can select Fin7, we can add a score of 1, and then what we can do is we can name the layer Fin7. And the idea is, and I'll explain you why I'm doing the scores and how we can iterate. So we're just going to build a few layers, and then we're going to build a layer from layer, and I'll explain how it all comes together. So if we add another layer, so we'll do Fin8. Then we can also add so what's happening now, for example, in Russia, we can track something like sandworm that comes from Russia. So I think that's relevant for what's happening right now. So we can add them. Score of 1. And that will be sandworm. And then we can add another 2 groups that come from Russia. For example, they will be APT 28. And we'll do one more. We can do APT 29, that also comes from Russia. So now we have 5 APT groups and 5 layers. So the idea is now we can all combine this and we can create a layer from another layer. So the idea is we can pick a domain, which is we can use the same enterprise attack 10, and we can express our score. So the goal is here to combine all of them together. So as you can see in yellow, we have all our groups, and then we do A plus B plus C plus D and plus E. And then we can create a new layer. So ideally here, I'll change, because I don't like the coloring the way it is. So normally I would change the colors because I would like my most matches to be in red instead of green. So we can change the layers. So this one would be, we'll do green. And then the bottom one, we can do red. So this way, we can see expressively on a heat map. Those the ones that are the darkest red, obviously they have the most matches. So that means that all 5 APT groups use those techniques. So when we map those, so because we can export, so there's a few ways we can now use this as well. So we can render and create a picture if we want, for example, and render it to an SVG, which creates kind of a nice picture. But we can also, what we can do is we can save these layers in JSON format, and then we can iterate and create layers from layers, how we can, help, because there's a few examples that we can do from here. But the first goal for me was when we started building the SOC is build this heat map. We can export it in Excel, and obviously I listed all the techniques that match from highest to lowest. So obviously that's my priority, to bring the data ingestion. So each of these techniques that are in red, you can map them to a data source from Mitre Attack as well. And that perfectly aligns how you can basically get the relevant data sources and bring them in, and how we can start, building use cases and wrapping analytics around those data sources, and how we can actually detect those techniques that threat actors would use, especially the threat actors that are relevant for us. But it depends where you are in your journey, because, for example, I've been approached as well by companies where, for example, they try to move their, for example, SIEM from say from Splunk to another sort of SIEM, and they just say they inherited set up Splunk that has a bunch of data, but they don't really know what that data tells them, or what that data does. So, when you kind of move towards a new, you can again kind of reevaluate what data you have. And I think the new iterations as well, what Mitre have built as well, what's quite good. So once you have this first kind of layer where you build your threat actors, what you can also do, for example, if you say, for example, if you're in a scenario where you say you inherited a certain, SIEM, and you're trying to kind of look where you are in the world, what's happening. So, for example, you can can create another layer where you map all your data sources that you currently have, and again, you can layer it over those threat actor groups and see where the gaps are. So hopefully you can detect the gaps. You can also create a layer for the mitigations that potentially you have at the moment in place, and how, what potentially, that's where the strategy planning comes in place, where you can decide how you're gonna, for example, develop spending in terms of mitigations, in terms of, data sources. you can even, iterate, and for example, new software, new ransomware groups come out, a new malware. You can create layers for malware to track, and then compare your data sources or your mitigations that you have currently in place, and kind of compare the capability gap assessment, within your SOC. I think this is a great kind of tool how you can, combine that end to end and see a visibility, and especially as I mentioned, there is loads of tools being developed, and I think everyone's kind of working towards embedding Mitre Attack in their framework. So, for example, we just started using breach and attack simulation tools as well. So that gives us again another iteration where we can test, our kind of enterprise capabilities and tools against, various techniques. For example, I can build a JSON layer and I can just in my breach and attack simulation tools, and I can do a weekly, monthly test against specific techniques, and see how my defenses perform. And that will give me kind of a gaps analysis assessment, as well as, where we need to invest potentially on our defenses, where the gaps are. We just started using a tool, for example, for analysts lab training as well, and they are kind of big protagonists using Mitre Attack as well. So, for example, once we hiring some junior analysts, for example, so I can, based on our SOC and threat actors that are relevant for our SOC and what kind of use cases that we have, I can develop a labs to assess basically their capabilities, and as well to improve their training in specific techniques that are relevant for us as a company. So that it gives that kind of the whole aligned framework how we can, map and bring it all together and use it. So I think it's a perfect example how we can, build and use those tools, and build those integrations. I think there is loads of useful tools as well on GitHub, I think, where, people use open source kind of Python libraries where you can again ingest those JSON layers and map to various tools and test your defenses. It's just, I think it's getting better and better as we mature and as the Mitre Attack itself evolves. So I think its usability, it's just going to grow over time. So back to the slides if we go. So once we kind of built and kind of developed a heat map, as I just showed you guys, it looks something like that. So there's another example of that's how it's rendered. If you render an SVG, and for example, you can have a picture in your SOC, how it looks like. This one is built on V9, which is, there's a new one, version 10 now, but it just kind of shows you where, for example, you have a legend there, and the red ones obviously is the ones that has the highest matches. So obviously that's your kind of priority. So if we look from that heat map example, so I picked the T1027. That's the technique that has the highest matches. So obviously that's my first kind of data source that should go into my SOC. So this is the technique. It's called every technique has an ID as well. So you can, if you go to Mitre Attack, you can search by IDs. And as well, when you build the layer, you can add IDs into layer in Navigator. So this way it kind of helps you find the specific techniques. And then basically from this description, as you can see, you can build use cases. It has tactics. It's explained on what, platforms, and you have a list of data sources as well in here. So where would you look to ingest data from, and also as well how you can potentially look how defenses can be bypassed with that technique. So it's a great example. So if we kind of expand that, so this is the technique, obfuscated files or information. So detection, some of these techniques can be harder to detect. Some of them you would mitigate, some of them you detect, but as this one says, it can be difficult to detect unless artifacts can be left behind. But the idea is you would flag and analyze commands with suspicious syntax and escape characters like shown in the image. You would ingest and monitor Windows Sysmon event IDs 4688 to detect command line arguments and processes. And then you can use network intrusion detection and prevention systems to detect network exfiltration as well as email scanning compliance. So, there's a lot of information that you can combine while building use cases, gathering that, data sources and how we can detect those specific techniques. And then once we move to the next kind of level is how we, wrap analytics and around those use cases, how we can create analytics based on previous slide and how we can detect that kind of suspicious behavior. And then once we kind of did that, I think the kind of next iteration in your SOC is to fine tune analytics and reduce the false positives and false negatives. As I mentioned again, how we can create automations to cover some of the simpler response scenarios, depends on your SOC as well. When I say to people, I think automation in kind of embedding is becoming more and more important. Obviously depends on your SOC. Some people work around the sun. Some people, for example, have a SOC, or they have an extension of their SOC, third-party SOC. So maybe your analysts are working only 9 to 5. So you can leverage automation tools where, for example, what we've done, we have an automation tools that enrich our incidents. So we have, IP reputation, domain reputation. We have an extra, threat intelligence to enrich our incidents. We can combine our, for example, EDR tools. So when there is an incident, you can create automation rules to collect investigation package and, for example, isolate that machine until the following morning if it happens out of hours. So you can prevent the spread of the specific malware, or you can investigate in the morning based on the investigation package, and then you can either release the machine or you need to re-image the machine and things like that. So those are kind of automation, enrichment, and responses. It helps a great deal to prevent bad things from happening. And then, as I mentioned, I mentioned a few of Mitre Attack kind of changes and iterations to the framework that happens. So one of the newer ones is Mitre Attack Defend. So this is kind of the whole bigger framework of how we develop, and how we react to what we built in a navigator. So there is a specific, attacks that you can map to how we can harden, how we can detect and isolate, and then deceive. So I think that's kind of, it brings some of the things together, but as well, there is a Mitre Attack shield that kind of builds more on the deception technology. So I think deceive is just only a little part of the defend, but this is a kind of knowledge graph of cybersecurity kind of countermeasures, how we can, stop from things happening and how we can prevent from, from various threat actors and what they would do and how we can basically bolster our defenses. So again, the first navigator kind of layers that we built, you can map to defend and, harden our defenses. As I mentioned, again, use CAR, so the kind of analytics repository as well, to develop various use cases, how we can detect that. And then as we kind of grow and mature the SOC, I think the kind of the next iteration is we can map, as I said, those kind of techniques. So for example, there was a technique that I mentioned in the previous slide, T1027, which is obfuscated files and information. That directly you can map it to Mitre Attack Shield, which is technique DTE is 17, which is decoy system. So a defender could implement a decoy system to study how and when an adversary tries to obfuscate files or hide information. So that's a kind of another next step into learning about threat actors that potentially could be, attacking your organization and hopefully increasing their dwell time, and hopefully, they leaving some breadcrumbs so you can, see what they've done and iterate and better your defenses moving forward. So and I think it's continuous and evolves kind of loop cycle, I think, because it's, I don't think you can ever reach a kind of a state of your SOC that you think you are safe. So I think the idea is, as I mentioned, to start with sort of 5 or 6 APT groups, and then I think you can build on that. You can add specific APT groups, or you can, based on your threat intelligence, you can add malware or ransomware strains that you think would be relevant for your organization. You can map those, and again, you can constantly assess, do a gap analysis and assess where you stand. and potentially discover whether there's any gaps and how we can bolster our defenses moving forward. And it's a continuous kind of never-ending cycle how we can test and bolster our defenses, and then test again, and then keep emulating those threat actors in our environments to test the defenses. So that's the kind of a bigger expansion of decoy system deployment. So I think once we started implementing some of the decoy systems, and again it goes back to the fact of everything comes down to spending. So I guess it depends on your budget and depends what kind of threat actors you're trying to defend from, and based on your risk appetite and kind of threat sophistication level that you're going to work at, you can implement some simple stuff sometimes, stuff like decoy accounts, decoy VPN servers, decoy tokens, or if you're a bigger organization, you can develop to a point where you can do the whole decoy kind of networking kind of whole subnets, where hopefully you can lead the threat actors for even decoy websites and decoy systems that will recognize things like virtualization. There's a minefield that you can do to hopefully get more information and bolster your defenses, and then that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to kind of cover, and hopefully you guys had a better insight, and hopefully anyone has any questions, I'm happy to expand, or you guys had my name, you can ping me on LinkedIn or even Twitter. I'm always happy to help people, but if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer or to explain or work through anything that you guys think needs more explanation to you.
I'm not sure if you saw, I had a question in the chat.
Yep.
But I'll say it now.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi. No, I think this is a really nice way to focus your defense on what matters and like what is applicable to you. I was just wondering, so you probably integrate this with like a SIM and then use a SOAR for remediation. Do you recommend any specific tools that you use to leverage this?
I think it depends on your setup. I think, as I mentioned, I think most of the kind of vendors and tools are working towards kind of enabling and embedding the Mitre Attack in the framework. I think because it has such a big impact and such a big adoption. I'm not a protagonist of any specific tools. I'm, for example, my expertise at the moment is, we kind of moved our SIEM into the cloud, so kind of in Sentinel, and I think the kind of that space works really well. But I'm sure, with most of the SIEMs, you can pretty much cover that. And I think the key aspect of is, once you develop your framework and align the data sources, is just about, wrapping your analytics and then, embedding that in your SOAR, based on those analytics and those use cases that you developed on those data sources that you mapped to Mitre Attack. So don't think there's a kind of relevant way to be tools. I think there's people even now, you can leverage most of it with Elasticstack and open source technologies. And as I mentioned, there is a big GitHub community where people building Python tools that you can leverage that as well. So yeah, I think that works great. Anyone else have any more question, guys?
Can you see the chats?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, Marius has got a question. I can ask him to unmute if he wants to ask the question himself.
Yeah, sure.
There you go. Marius, you should be able to unmute now.
Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, I can.
It was more of a comment rather than a question. I think the really interesting thing here is that mapping of the technique to the data source.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges when you create a SOC and a SIM tool is actually getting all the data in and prioritizing which data that you're going to be ingesting. You don't want to have a lot of data that you can't correlate, you can't use in any way. So I think this matching the groups with the techniques to the actual data sources that you need, and then based on that, creating your use cases is very, very powerful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's an iteration of that as well, because how we've done. So, for example, you know, when you develop a heat map, and as I mentioned, you know, the idea was the heat map was that you map all the techniques based on priority. So obviously the ones with the top matches are at the top. So, you know, what we did, you can create, for example, you know, kind of put them in a project tool, and you can map resources and how this data is going to get, you know, aligned to the resources and when they're going to be ingested. But at the same time, I think as well, you know, once we move into, you know, in specific themes, you know, nowadays, especially if you're moving towards cloud, you know, data ingested are costed. So, you know, you don't want to ingest data for the sake of ingesting. So you have a kind of business use case prioritization where you ingest only relevant data that maps to specific threat actors that are relevant for your organization, you know. And I think this is the key kind of from business aspects. So you're not wasting data, you're not wasting money. Everything is mapped towards what is relevant for your organization.
Yeah, that's quite important, because in the past we basically threw a lot of money at SIMs, and there was a lot of data in there that basically couldn't correlate with anything. So I've got actually a question on the tooling there. Can he do the reverse? Can I provide him the actual data sources that I'm receiving and actually match which use cases or techniques I'm actually able to detect?
Yeah, so I don't know if you saw, but basically when I showed Mitre Navigator, there is 4 kind of layers that you can build. So you can build layers based on threat actor groups. You can build layers based on software strains, so which is basically malware and ransomware strains. You can build all the layers based on mitigations that you have currently in place. And you can map all the data sources. So for example, the data, so if you come to a new SOC and you just been given a loads of data, so like you're given a seam that potentially the guys are ingesting certain data. So you can create layers, or you can create one big layer, putting all your data sources in, and then you can create a heat map basically of the coverage that you have over Mitre Attack. And then again, as I said, you can create a layer from layer. So you can create another layer where you put all the threat actors that are relevant to you, and then you can map them and then see potentially where you are either missing a data source or where you have too much data for threats that are not necessarily relevant. So you can correlate them together, and you can, as I say, you can do gap analysis assessments, or you can assess whether you need an extra data, you know, sets for your threat actors.
Brilliant. Very powerful.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
No problem. Anything else, guys? You know, as I mentioned, you know, guys, if you know, if somebody's shy to say in person, you know, you can always ping me afterwards, either on LinkedIn, you know, or Twitter. I can, you know, or if someone needs, you know, an extra help, or they, you know, they want to discuss this in further, you can always, you know, grab a half hour chat with me, and you know, I'm happy to help when I can to people, you know, if they are in a task of building a SOC, or they, you know, want to do a gap analysis or things like, or anything like that.
Last call for any questions, No, I think we're all good. Marius, if you can send the slides over to me, that'd be great. We'll get them put up on the website as well, where people can view them. Brilliant. Thanks very much for joining. Bye.
No problem. Thank you very much.